The Zypharian war fleet arrived above New Bastion in a formation of gleaming, spear-like dreadnoughts, their hulls reflecting the cold void of space. They moved with predatory grace, a silent testament to their centuries of conquest. On the bridge of the lead vessel, Commander Varco stood tall, his reptilian features hard with certainty. This was not a battle. It was an execution. New Bastion was an afterthought in the grand scheme of the Empire, a fledgling human colony built on the bones of a half-terraformed world, its industry functional but primitive, a backwater, an inconvenience. Intelligence reports had been clear. The planet had no standing army, only a skeleton defense force barely fit to repel pirates. This should have been beneath him. Yet the Emperor himself had ordered the conquest. Humans, he claimed, were unpredictable. They had a history of defying logic, of turning lost battles into impossible victories. That mistake would not be repeated here. Varkos flexed his clawed fingers, watching his warlords prepare. At his side, General Karath, his personal enforcer, adjusted his massive gauntlets, their energy cores humming with restrained violence. Karath was a brute bred for war, standing over 7 feet tall and encased in armor that turned him into a walking fortress. He exuded confidence, as did the dozen other champions gathered in the war room, warriors who had personally crushed entire rebellions. "This will not be a battle," Karath rumbled. "This will be a demonstration." Varkos allowed himself a small, satisfied nod. "Then let us begin." The command was given. From the belly of the warships, drop pods screamed through the atmosphere, their hulls glowing with friction as they plummeted toward the surface. Thousands of Zypharian warriors descended like steel rain, the vanguard of an army that expected no resistance. On the ground, the colony was already in chaos. Inside New Bastion's primary command center, Captain Reynolds grimaced as a holographic map flickered with red markers. The enemy had landed across multiple sectors, securing key infrastructure within minutes. His men, what few he had left, were scrambling to establish even the barest defense. The colony's planetary defenses had been obliterated in a single strike, leaving them with nothing but small arms fire and a few outdated vehicles. Beside him, Lieutenant Carter, a lean, sharp-eyed officer, wiped sweat from his brow. "This isn't a fight. It's a goddamn massacre." Reynolds clenched his jaw. He had seen hopeless battles before, had fought in skirmishes where the odds were stacked against him. But this wasn't a skirmish. This was the weight of an empire coming down on their heads. His orders were clear. Evacuate as many civilians as possible and delay the inevitable. His comms buzzed. "Sir," a frantic voice cut in, "we've lost the East Sector. They're moving on the industrial district." Reynolds exhaled slowly. That was where the colony's engineers had taken shelter, where the only people left who could keep the colony running were holed up with nothing but tools and scrap metal. He had no soldiers left to send, and even if he did, what difference would it make? A second voice, far more irritated, broke through. "Then let them come." It snapped. "I'm not leaving." Reynolds froze. He recognized that voice. Claire, across the colony, inside the heart of New Bastion's industrial sector, Claire Reynolds, lead mechanic and full-time problem solver, stood in the middle of the cluttered workshop, arms crossed and expression thunderous. Around her, a handful of engineers and technicians exchanged uneasy glances. They had been expecting an evacuation order. Instead, they had Claire, standing there with a wrench bigger than some of their heads, refusing to budge. One of the younger engineers, a wiry man named Davis, cleared his throat. Claire, did you hear that? The military's pulling back. The Empire's coming here." She rolled her shoulders, cracking her neck. "Yeah, I heard." Silence stretched between them. Someone coughed. Finally, Marcus, the grizzled veteran of the team, rubbed his forehead. "And shouldn't we be running then?" Claire picked up a length of steel piping and tested its weight. "Run where?" she said, voice flat. "You think we're getting off-world? You think those fancy lizards are going to let us go?" She gestured to the massive power generators thrumming behind them. "We are the colony. If we leave, nothing works. If nothing works, everyone dies." Davis swallowed. "Okay, but..." "No," She cut him off, eyes flashing. No, but I'm not dying on some refugee ship, because we let those bastards roll over us. They want this colony? They're going to have to work for it. There was a pause, then a sharp, metallic snap as she brought the wrench down on a nearby workbench, sending tools scattering. Now, she continued, voice low but charged with energy, who's with me? No one spoke at first. The engineers weren't soldiers. They weren't warriors. They were fixers, the people who kept things running when everything else fell apart. But then Marcus sighed, stepping forward and rolling up his sleeves. Well, he muttered, grabbing a welding torch, if I'm going to die, I'd rather do it on my own damn terms. Davis groaned, but grabbed a modified power drill that had enough torque to snap a wrist if wielded properly. One by one, the others followed. Claire smirked. That's more like it. Outside, the Xipherian warriors approached, their towering frames moving through the empty streets with eerie precision. Their armor shimmered under the colony's artificial lights, weapons primed and scanning for resistance. The silence of the city unnerved even them. At the head of the squad, Captain Zrak raised a fist, signaling a halt. He tapped a control panel on his wrist, scanning the industrial district ahead. The heat signatures inside were strange, active power sources, but no significant life signs. A trap? He bared his fangs in amusement. Let them try. He gestured forward, and his warriors advanced. Inside the workshop, Claire tightened her grip on her wrench. The first of the Empire's forces was moving in, expecting no fight. She intended to prove them very, very wrong. Captain Zrak moved with calculated confidence, his squad of Xipherian warriors fanning out behind him as they advanced through the industrial district. Their armor, sleek and segmented, absorbed the ambient light, casting them as wraith-like figures against the steel and concrete of the human settlement. They'd encountered no resistance so far, no soldiers, no barricades, no desperate last stand. Just the cold hum of machinery and the distant thrum of power generators. A perfect example of what these lesser species always did when faced with the might of the Empire. They ran. Zrak relished the thought. There was no honor in slaughtering the weak, but there was satisfaction in demonstrating superiority. The humans had abandoned the sector, leaving only an automated power grid still churning in the background. He gestured to his second-in-command, a lean, blade-fingered warrior named Keth, who scanned the area with a flick of his visor. No heat signatures aside from machinery, Keth reported. No movement. Zrak allowed himself a slow exhale. The colony's so-called defenders had already been crushed in the initial assault, their remaining forces retreating to civilian districts like frightened vermin. This was merely cleanup. Advance, he ordered. The squad pressed forward, boots striking against metal walkways as they entered the factory's central processing hub. It was an expansive chamber, tower and machines standing silent in the dim light. Conveyor belts frozen mid-production. Stacks of steel plating and crates of industrial components lined the walls. The scent of oil and burning circuits lingered, but something else hovered beneath it, a faint, acrid tang in the air. Zrak frowned. The factory wasn't abandoned. He barely had time to open his mouth before the room exploded. The blast ripped through the formation, sending Xipherian warriors crashing against metal supports and slamming into walls. A concussive shockwave shattered overhead lights, plunging the chamber into flickering half-darkness. Fire erupted from ruptured pipelines, casting jagged shadows across the battlefield. Zrak hit the ground hard, his visor flashing red with damage reports. Before he could rise, something heavy smashed into his shoulder, knocking him sideways. He twisted, bringing up his rifle. A wrench slammed into his wrist. Metal met reinforced plating with a bone-jarring clang, the force snapping servos and disrupting his grip. The rifle tumbled from his grasp. He barely registered the motion before a second strike caught him across the jaw, sending his vision spinning. Through the haze, he caught his first real glimpse of his attacker. She wasn't a soldier. She wasn't armored, wasn't carrying an energy weapon or a combat blade. Just a human, covered in oil stains and welding burns, dressed in a mechanic's jumpsuit. And she was angry. Claire didn't stop. She drove forward, using the momentum of her swing to keep Zrak off balance. He tried to recalibrate, tried to rise, but she was already moving, slipping under his reach and slamming the wrench into the side of his helmet with force that sent sparks flying. His heads-up display cracked, lines of static running across his vision. "Welcome to New Bastion," she snarled. Zrak lashed out, claws swiping toward her midsection, but she was already gone, ducking beneath a strike and driving her boot into his knee joint. His leg buckled, servos protesting. Then the others joined in. From the shadows, figures emerged, engineers, mechanics, workers, all armed with whatever they had scavenged. Welding torches ignited, casting flickering blue flames. Power tools roared to life, their modified drill bits gleaming. Steel pipes, crowbars, and repurposed industrial arms were raised like crude but effective weapons. The Zypharians had expected defenseless civilians. What they got was a riot of furious engineers. Zrak barely had time to bark a command before all hell broke loose. The ambush was surgical in its chaos. Claire's crew moved with precision, using the factory's machinery as both cover and weaponry. Giant hydraulic arms, remotely activated, snatched Zypharians off their feet, crushing armor plates and sending warriors crashing into metal walls. Conveyor belts, suddenly operational, dragged unsuspecting invaders into the depths of the factory's inner workings, where superheated metal molds awaited. Davis, usually the quietest of the group, now wielded an industrial-strength rivet gun, firing high-velocity bolts into Zypharian armor joints. One warrior dropped, screaming as servos locked up. Another lunged for him, only to be blinded by Marcus's welding torch, its white-hot glare searing against sensitive Zypharian optics. Keth tried to recalibrate, tried to regroup the squad, but every time they adjusted, the humans changed the battlefield again. Plasma rifles malfunctioned, scrambled by short-range electromagnetic pulses rigged into the factory's walls. Cooling systems failed, their heat sinks sabotaged by hacked ventilation protocols, forcing warriors to shed their armor before it melted around them. It wasn't just an ambush. It was a dissection. Zrak, struggling to his feet, saw the battle unraveling. His warriors, genetically superior, cybernetically enhanced, were losing to civilians, to engineers, to a woman with a wrench. He snarled, reaching for his secondary weapon, a plasma blade that ignited with a low hum. He wouldn't be humiliated like this. He wouldn't. A pipe slammed into his wrist, the impact jarring the blade from his grip. Claire was already there, wrench in one hand, fury in her eyes. "You know," she said conversationally, "I've had just about enough of you assholes wrecking my town." Then she swung. The wrench came down hard, right against the exposed wiring of his helmet's cracked visor. The system short-circuited instantly, sending a jolt of energy straight through his nervous system. His body seized, armor locking up, muscles spasming. He collapsed, twitching, the scent of burned circuits filling the air. The factory fell silent. Around them, the remaining Zypharian warriors lay defeated, disarmed, or unconscious, their elite status rendered meaningless in the face of human ingenuity. Marcus exhaled heavily, pushing back his welding mask. "Well," he muttered, surveying the damage, "that was new." Davis, gripping his now empty rivet gun, let out a nervous laugh. "We just took out an Imperial War squad." Claire rolled her shoulders, stepping over Zrak's immobilized form. "Yeah," she said, wiping grime from her forehead. "And their boss is going to be pissed." She wasn't wrong, because high above the colony, aboard the Zypharian flagship, Commander Varkos watched the disaster unfold in real time. His elite warriors, his hand-picked best, had been crushed, not by trained soldiers, not by an army, but by workers, technicians, civilians, by a single human woman who had just dismantled them with nothing but tools and sheer audacity. His claws dug into the armrest of his throne-like command chair, fury burning through his veins. "This is unacceptable," he growled. Beside him, General Karoth watched the feed, his expression unreadable. Then, slowly, he smiled. "She is formidable," Karoth rumbled. Varkos' eyes narrowed. "You find this amusing?" "I find it interesting." A long pause. Then Karoth cracked his knuckles, the sound like grinding stone. Allow me to handle this personally. The first wave had been repelled. Barely. Claire stood over the wreckage of the industrial sector, wiping sweat and grime from her forehead. Around her, the ragtag group of engineers and technicians were tending to wounds, reloading makeshift weapons, and fortify what little cover they had. The Zypharians would come again. She knew that much. This wasn't over. And if they wanted to take New Bastion, she'd make them fight for every damn inch of it. A sharp crackle in her earpiece signaled an incoming transmission. Captain Reynolds' voice, tight with tension, filtered through. "Claire," he said, "I don't know how you did it, but that was the first real victory we've had since this started. The colony's talking. People are hopeful." A pause. "But Varkos isn't going to let this slide. We intercepted their comms. He's deploying Korath." She exhaled slowly. "And who's that?" "Empire's version of a war god. Korath doesn't just fight. He ends wars. They don't send him in unless they want something erased." Claire's grip tightened on her wrench. "Then we'd better make sure he's got nothing left to erase." She cut the connection and turned to the others. "All right, listen up. That was just the first round. They're coming back, and they're bringing someone nasty. We don't have an army. We don't have heavy artillery. But you know what we do have." Davis raised a hand. A severe lack of self-preservation?" "Damn right," Claire said. "And the home field advantage." Marcus grunted, adjusting a shoulder plate he had salvaged from a downed Zypharian. "You got a plan, boss?" Claire's smile was feral. "We're mechanics," she said. "Let's start breaking things." The second wave hit hard. Korath led from the front, towering over the other Zypharians like a walking fortress. His armor was reinforced with kinetic dampeners, his gauntlets crackling with energy. The moment his boots hit the colony's surface, he charged, tearing through buildings like they were made of paper. But Claire had expected brute force, which was why she'd rigged the streets with false terrain. Koratha's squad advanced, only to sink knee-deep into what should have been solid ground. Industrial coolant, mixed with adhesive resin, had turned whole streets into traps. The more they struggled, the deeper they sank. Weapons jammed, servos locked, and visibility dropped as steam vents erupted, blinding their advance. Then came the distractions. Drones, hacked and repurposed, zipped to the battlefield, carrying blaring sirens and flashing strobes designed to overwhelm Zypharian optics. Workers hidden in the shadows struck from above, using magnetic grapples to latch onto exposed armor joints and rip plating away. Claire herself took the fight straight to Korath. She dropped from a rooftop, wrench swinging in a perfect arc. He barely managed to block, the impact shuddering through his gauntlet. "You!" he rumbled, voice filled with something between amusement and rage. "Yeah," Claire said, shoving off his arm. "Me!" She ducked under his retaliatory strike, twisting to land a blow to his exposed side. His armor took the hit, but the force disrupted his stance just enough for a second attack. From behind him, Marcus fired a salvaged energy cutter, searing through one of Koratha's shoulder plates. The metal buckled, sending up sparks. Korath turned, fast, but Claire was faster. She grabbed a loose power cable and jammed it into the exposed section of his armor. The jolt was instantaneous. Korath staggered, muscles locking as raw energy coursed through him. He roared, ripping the cable free, but the damage was done. His systems were glitching. His strength was compromised. Claire planted her boot against his chest and shoved, sending him crashing through a ruined wall. The battlefield fell into chaos. The Zypharians, despite their superior numbers, were unraveling. Claire's team used every trick they had, hacked machinery, environmental hazards, and sheer reckless ingenuity to keep the Empire's forces off balance. And for the first time in Zypharian history, a war of attrition wasn't working in their favor. Korath rose from the rubble, breathing heavily. His forces were faltering, his soldiers panicking. He locked eyes with Claire. She grinned. Smoke coiled to the shattered streets of New Bastion, the air thick with the acrid scent of burnt metal and ozone. Fires flickered in the distance, casting jagged shadows over the wreckage of Zypharian war machines. The battlefield, once a brutal display of imperial dominance, had become something else entirely, a graveyard of arrogance. Claire stood amidst the debris, her breath ragged, her wrench slick with oil and alien blood. The last engagement had pushed them to the brink, but they were still standing. Somehow, against all odds, they were still here. Across the ruined plaza, Korath struggled to rise. His massive form, once an unstoppable force, was now a wreck of sparking circuits and fractured armor. One gauntlet was fused at the joints, the other missing entirely. His once pristine chest plate was cracked open, exposing a tangle of burnt-out servos and flickering energy conduits. He lifted his head, meeting Claire's gaze with something that wasn't quite anger. Not anymore. Recognition. She wiped grime from her cheek, rolling her shoulders as she took a step forward. Still breathing, Korath exhaled a slow, measured breath, the sound more resigned and furious. He planted a fist against the ground, forcing himself upright. Around him, the remaining Xipherian soldiers, those not already incapacitated, trapped, or outright beaten, hovered in uncertainty. Then, through the haze of the battlefield, a transmission crackled through his comms. Commander Varkos. The voice of the Imperial leader carried an edge of disbelief, as if he still struggled to process what had happened. The impossible had occurred. The finest warriors of the Xipherian Empire had been humiliated, not by a rival military, not by another great power, by engineers, by a colony of mechanics and civilians who refused to die quietly. Varkos' tone was clipped, force and control. This campaign has become unviable. A silence stretched across the comm channel. Then the words no Xipherian had ever expected to hear. We are withdrawing. A ripple of stunned disbelief passed through the remaining invaders. Some seemed frozen in place, as if they simply couldn't comprehend the meaning. The Xipherian Empire did not retreat. It did not surrender. And yet, high above, the Empire's warships began to pull away from orbit, their engines burning hot against the dark sky. Landing crafts that had once ferried waves of warriors reversed course, their pilots silent with shame. The Empire was leaving. Korath, still standing despite the damage, looked to the retreating forces. Then, slowly, back to Claire. Victory, he rumbled, should not have been yours. She exhaled, tossing her wrench from one hand to the other. Yeah, well, guess nobody told us that. For a long moment, he simply watched her. Then, with a slow nod, perhaps a respect, perhaps a reluctant acknowledgement, he turned and signaled to his remaining soldiers. And just like that, the war was over. A low cheer rose from the workers, disbelieving at first, then swelling into something almost deafening. Victory wasn't something they had expected, but it was something they had earned. Marcus let out a barking laugh, clapping Davis on the back. Well, I'll be damned. Davis, still wide-eyed, shook his head. They ran. Claire let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. The fight was over. They had won. But somewhere, deep in the back of her mind, she knew this wasn't the end. The Xipherians would remember this day.